Now let's look at the few guidelines for choosing the right type of assessment. The first, of course, is cost. And the cost is not only the cost of implementing such an assessment, but also acquiring it. You might have to get the right authorization to be able to acquire and use psychometric tools that are most apt for your students. The next would also be the cost of training the individuals like yourself to be able to analyze those reports. The third would be the cost of the tools that are used to implement the assessment, whether it's going to be an online assessment or an offline one, the kind of expenses that you might incur in printing test question papers, and also answer sheets which are usually done in an OMR format. So when you're looking at the cost, you would have to consider the cost of acquiring an assessment, to the cost of certification and the cost of implementation as well. Usually, the lower the cost, the better it is to be able to conduct such assessments on a regular basis. However, the regularity of the assessment is usually defined by the type of the assessment that is being built. Moving on to the next part, which is the target audience. Not all psychometric assessments are designed for all types of audiences. You would have to understand the sample size that was kept in mind when the assessment tool was being built. So if the assessment tool has been built from students from class 9th to class 12th, it might not make a lot of sense to allow class 8 and class 7 students to take the test, or use older students to take the same psychometric assessment that was not built for them. The target audience defines the scope of work in which an assessment tool is supposed to be used. Moving on to the format, whether you're taking an online assessment or an offline assessment, personally I feel online assessments are quicker. They help you reduce less wastage and help you keep control of costs and facilitate assessments really quickly. Now looking at online assessments, you usually would get a report in a matter of seconds. The minute you submit the assessment, you would get a generated report. In case of offline assessments, there is additional time that needs to be considered in evaluating the assessment. But before that, sending it to the evaluator, evaluating the assessments, and then generating the reports. If an offline assessment is conducted, one will have to see what is the fastest method in which this can be done. But in the presence of a computer lab which is functional, which has internet connection, and an assessment tool that allows for an online system to facilitate it, would be much more useful for both you and the students. Next is looking at the psychometric properties that the assessment would evaluate. Now it is important to understand which areas will be assessed by this tool, whether it's interest, personality, aptitude, skills, and also a rationale as to why those areas need to be assessed for this age group. During the acquisition and the training on the tool itself, you should be able to get clarity on how it was built, what are the areas that it aims to assess, what are the types of answers that it aims to generate for the student, and what is the type of help you can hope to get through the help of the psychometric tool. The time taken to administer and interpret the assessment is directly linked to the format of the assessment itself. Now within that, one has to consider the time required to be able to first orient the students, to completing the assessment, to evaluating and then generating the reports as well. Like I said earlier, an online assessment is the most seamless way to do this really fast. The qualifications of the interpreter, in many cases which would be you, is also quite important. Have you been certified on evaluating that tool? Do you understand how that report is generated? Do you understand how to interpret it to students as well? And also to remember that while evaluating those tools, you are also subjective in many cases and might not be able to provide a certain solution with 100% consistency. These are error margins that we will always have to consider. And when we're looking at explaining these assessment reports to students, it's important to keep in mind that none of these assessments guarantee 100% accuracy. It's important to keep in mind that most of these assessments work on a probability scale based on understanding who the student is right now. It rarely can figure out what the student will become later with a certain level of consistency and definition. Now, in such cases, it is also important to help create a realistic picture that while certain careers might have come up on the report, it is important for the student to keep consistent efforts to be able to pursue that area successfully. It's not enough for a psychometric assessment to tell a student that you're going to be great at these few careers. It's also important for us to tell the students that the remaining of the effort, now that we identified the goal, the journey towards the goal is entirely the students to take. And you are there with the ecosystem of stakeholders to be able to support the student throughout that entire journey. Finally, the documentation of the interpretation is really important. I feel it's best for us to remember that students usually have very, very low retention and are subject to forgetting information quite fast. It's important to document the summary of the discussion, the plan of action, and the areas of opportunity for the student. We all know that students tend to forget really fast until it is maintained on a document. So, it is important that all such observations, interventions could be broken down in 3 basic paragraphs, which could be paragraph number 1, a simple summary of what you discussed with the student. Paragraph number 2, which could be the areas of opportunity for the child. And paragraph number 3, what is the action plan to work on those areas of opportunity and the plan ahead. This should be shared with both the students and the parents, and you also need to keep a record of this discussion as well. Now, this would help you continue the conversation the next time you meet them, and also reduce the chances of having some information that gets forgotten over time. With this, you can really evaluate the level of progress that the student has made from one point to another. And it could be beyond the academics. It could be behavioral. It could be a change in the timetable and their attitude as well towards the kind of efforts that they've been putting in. And some assessments are designed in such a way where you could take an assessment over a certain period of time again to see what is the variance of a student from one point to another. In some cases, if you want to change the kind of options you want to go for, at that point as well, whether a relevant psychometric tool could be implemented to help you change those options. So these are 4 of the guidelines for choosing psychometric assessments. Let's move on to the next point.